Tonight I want to tell you about a scandal that began with words on paper, not shouted words, not spoken accusations, just ink on envelopes, slipped quietly into letter boxes, unsigned and untraceable, words that shocked their readers, words that upended lives, words that revealed something dark about who we choose to believe. And why? Breathe slowly. Let yourself settle. Because this story, like all good mysteries, begins in a place where nothing much seems to happen. Littlehampton, Sussex, in the early 1920s. A small seaside town shaped by routines, by the rhythm of tides and the predictable turning of seasons. By morning, walks along the promenade where the same faces appeared at the same hours. By afternoons that carried the faint scent of salt air mixed with coal smoke from chimneys. By evenings that settled into a familiar, orderly quiet. People knew one another by sight here. They noticed things, a curtain drawn at an unusual hour, a stranger lingering too long, a letter arriving too frequently at a neighbor's door. In a place like this, reputation was everything. Your good name was the currency you lived on. And words, spoken or written, had weight. They could build you up or tear you down, sometimes irreversibly. So when anonymous letters began appearing in letterboxes around town, it wasn't just what they said that disturbed people. It was what they represented, a violation of the unspoken rules that kept society functioning. An attack from an invisible source. Poison delivered through the mail slot. The letters were crude, shockingly so for the time, filled with insults, accusations, and language that violated every expectation of polite correspondence. Which kind of words respectable people didn't speak, let alone write down and mail to their neighbors. And they kept coming, week after week, month after month, building fear, building suspicion, until the town could no longer ignore them. This is the story of those letters. But more than that, it's the story of two women. One who wrote them, one who was blamed for them, and how class, prejudice, and moral certainty combined to produce a miscarriage of justice that would haunt Littlehampton for years to come. We move slowly tonight, with care, because the truth, when it finally emerged, was more complicated than anyone expected. To understand what happened in Littlehampton, we need to understand the world it was part of. The First World War had ended just a few years earlier. Britain was exhausted. Not just physically, though the trenches had taken nearly 1 million British lives, but emotionally, socially, spiritually. The country was trying to piece itself back together, trying to return to what people nostalgically called normalcy. But of course nothing was normal. Too much had changed. Too many men hadn't come home. Too many women had tasted independence, working in factories and hospitals, and now were being told to return to domestic life. The economy was struggling. Veterans were struggling. Everyone was trying to hold onto something stable in a world that felt fundamentally unstable. In small towns like Littlehampton, this manifested as a kind of desperate clinging to propriety, to the old rules, to the way things used to be, or at least to the way people remembered them being. Social hierarchy mattered more than ever because it was one of the few things that still made sense. You knew where you stood, you knew who was respectable and who wasn't, who could be trusted and who needed watching. Littlehampton itself was a modest place, not wealthy, not poor, a working seaside town with a promenade, some boarding houses, families who'd lived there for generations. The sea was both livelihood and backdrop. Fishermen still went out, tourists still came in summer, children still played on the shingle beaches. Picture narrow streets, terraced houses pressed together, laundry hanging between buildings, the constant call of gulls, the smell of fish and salt, and, in winter, coal fires burning in every hearth. It's into this world, this particular moment of British history, this particular place trying to maintain order, that our story unfolds. Let me introduce you to Edith Swan. Edith was, by all accounts, a pillar of respectability. She attended church faithfully, not just on Sundays, but for midweek services and committees. She kept a tidy house. She presented herself with care, neat clothes, proper manners, the kind of woman neighbours would describe as very correct. To Edith, language mattered. Words were not casual things to be thrown around carelessly. They reflected character. They revealed breeding. They demonstrated, or failed to demonstrate, moral worth. She believed in standards, in propriety, in the idea that some people knew how to behave and others didn't, and that this distinction was important, natural even, necessary for society to function. When Edith looked at her community, she saw a world she wanted to preserve, where people knew their place, where decency was maintained, where the right sort of people set the tone for everyone else. Just streets away lived Rose Gooding. Rose's life followed a very different trajectory. She was Irish, from County Cork, records suggest, and she'd come to England as so many Irish had, looking for work, for opportunity, for something better than what home offered. She was unmarried, raising a child alone, working when she could find it, struggling when she couldn't. In post-war Littlehampton, these facts about Rose weren't just biographical details, they were marks against her. Her accent set her apart. Her unmarried status raised eyebrows. Her independence, born of necessity, not choice, was viewed with suspicion. Women like Rose existed on the margins of respectability, not quite inside the circle of trust, but tolerated as long as they kept their heads down and caused no trouble. Rose worked as a charwoman, cleaning houses, taking in laundry, the kind of physical labor that left your hands raw and your back aching. She lived in a small house that needed repairs she couldn't afford. She did her best to provide for her child in a world that offered women in her position very few options. These two women, Edith Swan and Rose Gooding, probably passed each other on the street regularly, maybe nodded in brief acknowledgement, maybe avoided eye contact entirely. In the social geography of Littlehampton, they occupied different territories, even though they lived just streets apart. One woman embodied what respectability looked like. The other represented what happened when you fell outside its protection. When the letters began, these distinctions would matter more than anyone could have imagined. The first letters appeared sometime in 1921, though accounts vary on the exact month. They arrived in ordinary envelopes, addressed in uncertain handwriting, postmarked, locally. When recipients opened them, they found something extraordinary. Pages filled with obscenities, insults, and accusations. Language that shocked even in private, let alone committed to paper and sent through His Majesty's mail. The letters accused neighbours of infidelity, of perversion, of crimes both real and imagined. They used words that respectable people in 1920s England simply didn't write down. Words that even now I won't reproduce here, not because they're unhistorical, but because the specific language matters less than what the letters represented. A deliberate assault on the social order. What made the letters particularly disturbing was their persistence. They didn't arrive once and stop. They kept coming, week after week, sometimes to the same people repeatedly, sometimes to new recipients. The writer seemed to know things about the town, personal details, neighborhood gossip, family situations, and the letters had a particular focus. They targeted women. Specifically, they went after women's sexual reputations, their moral character, their fitness as mothers and wives. This was psychological warfare conducted through the postal service. Recipients were frightened. Some were humiliated. All were confused. Who would do this and why? Neighbors began watching one another more carefully. Conversations became guarded. The invisible letter writer was like a ghost haunting the town. Unseen but powerfully present. Eventually, inevitably, people went to the police. And the police, in turn, began asking who in Littlehampton would write such things. The answer, it seemed to many, was obvious. Not Edith Swan, a church-going woman of unimpeachable reputation, but Rose Gooding, the Irish woman with the child born out of wedlock, who lived on the margins, who didn't quite fit in, who already made some people uncomfortable just by existing. Suspicion, once it finds a target, rarely needs much evidence to settle in. When the police began investigating, they brought the assumptions of their era with them. This wasn't malice, necessarily. It was simply how things were done. You looked for the most likely suspect, and likelihood was determined as much by social position as by evidence. You trusted certain people's word over others. You made judgments about character based on class, nationality, marital status, reputation. Rose Gooding became the focus of the investigation, not because of what the evidence said, but because of who she was. The police interviewed her. They examined her handwriting, comparing samples to the letters in informal, unscientific ways. They asked neighbors what they thought of her character. And neighbors, some perhaps genuinely believing it, others perhaps relieved to have someone to blame, provided testimony that confirmed what investigators already suspected. Records from the case suggest that handwriting analysis was conducted, but by standards we would now consider laughably inadequate. Experts weren't called in. Proper comparative methods weren't used. Instead, police officers and local officials eyeballed the letters and decided they saw similarities. Witness testimony was similarly problematic. People reported seeing Rose acting suspiciously. What did that mean? Perhaps walking quickly, perhaps avoiding eye contact, perhaps just being herself in ways that made people uncomfortable. One of the cruel ironies of cases like this is that the characteristics that make someone vulnerable to suspicion, being an outsider, lacking social capital, having no powerful friends, are the same characteristics that make it harder to defend yourself. Rose had no lawyer, no influential neighbors willing to vouch for her, no social standing to fall back on. When the authorities made up their minds, Rose Gooding had very few resources to fight back. She was arrested, charged with sending obscene materials through the mail, a serious criminal offence. And in 1921, she stood trial. The trial was brief. The evidence was circumstantial at best. But the verdict was decisive. Guilty. Rose Gooding was sentenced to prison. And here's where the story takes its darkest turn. While Rose sat in a cell, the letters continued to arrive in Littlehampton. Same handwriting, same vicious tone, same intimate knowledge of town gossip. If Rose was in prison, who was writing the letters? Imagine being Rose Gooding in that moment. You're sitting in a prison cell for a crime you didn't commit. Your child is being cared for by others. Your already fragile reputation is destroyed. Your life, such as it was, is in ruins. And somewhere in Littlehampton, the real letter writer is still free, still writing, still mailing poison through the post. How do you make people listen when they've already decided you're guilty? Prison conditions in 1920s. England were harsh, especially for women. Cells were cold, damp, poorly lit. The food was minimal, enough to survive on, not enough to thrive. Days were structured around labour, sewing, laundry, oakum picking. The routine was designed to be punishing, to break you down, to make you regret your crimes. But what do you regret when you're innocent? Rose, by all accounts, maintained her innocence throughout. But maintaining innocence in the face of conviction is exhausting. It requires a kind of strength most of us never have to test. Back in Littlehampton, the continued letters created a problem the authorities initially tried to ignore. Perhaps Rose had an accomplice. Perhaps she'd written them in advance and arranged for their delivery. These explanations strained credibility, but they were easier than admitting the alternative, that they'd convicted the wrong person. Eventually, and we're talking months here, not days, the weight of contradiction became impossible to dismiss. The letters were still coming. Rose was still in prison. Something was very, very wrong. A new investigation began. This time, more carefully. This time, with the uncomfortable awareness that the first investigation might have been built on assumptions rather than evidence. Suspicion shifted slowly, reluctantly, towards someone no one had expected. Edith Swan, the respectable woman, the churchgoer, the guardian of propriety. When investigators finally looked more carefully at Edith's handwriting, when they applied the scrutiny to her that they should have applied more broadly from the start, a different picture emerged. The similarities weren't with Rose's handwriting. They were with Edith's. When confronted with the evidence, Edith didn't sustain a denial for long. The truth emerged quietly, without the drama you might expect. She confessed. She had written the letters. All of them. For months. For years, depending on which accounts you read. But why? Understanding Edith's motivations requires us to think about moral panic, about anxiety, about what happens when someone's worldview feels under threat. Historians who've studied the case suggest, and I'll emphasize that this is interpretation, not certain fact, that Edith saw herself as a defender of decency, that she was genuinely disturbed by what she perceived as moral decline in her community, that the letters were, in her mind, a form of correction, a way of punishing behavior she found intolerable. This doesn't justify what she did, but it helps us understand it. Edith wasn't a cartoon villain. She was someone who believed so deeply in her own righteousness that she felt entitled to sit in judgment of others, to punish them, to use the most vicious language imaginable, while convincing herself she was defending virtue. There's something profoundly disturbing about that combination. Moral certainty plus cruelty, justified as protection of the social order. When her role became public, the town had to reckon with an uncomfortable truth. The threat hadn't come from the outsider, the vulnerable woman on the margins. It had come from inside respectability itself, from someone who looked like a pillar of the community. The person they'd trusted was guilty. The person they'd condemned was innocent. Rose Gooding was released from prison and received an official apology. But think about what that means in practical terms. She'd lost months of her life. Her reputation, already fragile, was shattered. Her child had been without her. Her home, her work, her standing in the community, all damaged, some irreparably. An apology doesn't restore time. It doesn't repair relationships. It doesn't undo the psychological trauma of being imprisoned for something you didn't do, of screaming your innocence into a void that wouldn't listen. Edith Swan, by contrast, received a sentence that historians generally describe as lenient. The court seemed to struggle with how to handle someone of her class and reputation who'd committed such offences. She was convicted, yes, but the punishment was measured in months, not years. And afterwards, quietly, she seems to have been able to rebuild some version of a life. The disparity is striking. The woman who was innocent suffered more than the woman who was guilty, not because the justice system failed to eventually reach the correct conclusion, but because by the time it did, the damage was done. What happened to Rose Gooding after her release is harder to trace. Unlike Edith Swan, she didn't leave much of a paper trail. We know she left prison. We know she received some compensation, but the details of her later life remain somewhat obscure, which itself tells us something about whose stories history preserves and whose it lets slip away. People on the margins leave fainter marks. The Littlehampton Libel Case, as it came to be known, is studied by historians today, not because it's unique, but because it's revealing. It shows us how confirmation bias works in practice. Once investigators decided Rose was guilty, they interpreted every piece of evidence through that lens. Things that might have exonerated her were ignored or explained away. Things that might have pointed to someone else weren't pursued. It shows us how class bias operates in systems of justice. Rose was easier to suspect because she was poor, Irish, unmarried. Edith was harder to suspect because she embodied respectability. The investigation followed the path of least social resistance. It shows us how gender-shaped assumptions in the early 20th century, the letters targeted women's sexual reputations specifically, using language that revealed deep anxieties about women's behavior in the post-war period. And the investigation itself was shaped by gendered assumptions about what that kind of woman might do. It shows us the danger of moral certainty. Edith Swan believed so completely in her own righteousness that she felt justified in attacking others. The investigators believed so completely in Rose's guilt that they didn't question their own assumptions. In both cases, certainty prevented wisdom, and it shows us something about vulnerability. Rose Gooding was vulnerable, not because she was guilty, but because she lacked protection. She had no social capital to draw on, no powerful friends, no presumption of innocence based on her reputation. She could be suspected, charged, and convicted on flimsy evidence because there was no one with enough power to demand better. That's what makes this case tragic rather than just unfortunate. It wasn't an accident. It was predictable, given who these women were, given the assumptions of the era, given how power and respectability functioned in small-town England. You might wonder why I'm telling you this story tonight, why a scandal from a small English town a century ago deserves an hour of your time as you're trying to fall asleep. Here's why. Because the mechanisms this case reveals are still with us. We still make assumptions about people based on their social position. We still find it easier to suspect outsiders than insiders. We still let moral certainty blind us to evidence. We still build cases around who someone is rather than what they did. The Littlehampton Letters case is a warning about the fragility of justice when it relies on familiarity rather than evidence, about what happens when institutions trust their own assumptions more than they trust the facts, about how easily the vulnerable can be scapegoated when something frightening happens and people want quick answers. Rose Gooding's story is repeated in different forms in courtrooms and communities around the world. People are still convicted based on who they are rather than what they did, still punished for failing to conform to social expectations, still denied the benefit of the doubt that others receive automatically. And Edith Swan's story is also repeated. People still weaponize morality, still use their own sense of righteousness as justification for cruelty, still hide behind respectability while doing damage. Understanding this case doesn't give us easy answers, but it might give us better questions. It might make us more careful about our own assumptions, more willing to interrogate our certainties, more aware of how power and vulnerability shape whose stories get believed. Littlehampton eventually returned to its rhythms. The letters stopped. The scandal faded from daily conversation. The sea kept its appointed rounds, in and out, patient and indifferent to human drama. New visitors came for the summer season. Children built sandcastles on the beach. Gulls called overhead. Life went on, as it always does, finding its way back to routine. But somewhere in the archives, in court documents and prison records, and newspaper clippings yellowed with age, the story waited for historians to find it, to piece it together, to ask what it meant. And what it meant was this: that words have power, that silence can be complicity, that respectability can deceive, that justice, when it relies on assumptions rather than evidence, can arrive at the wrong doorstep, and by the time it corrects itself, the damage is already done. Tonight, let this story rest with you gently, not as a call to action, but as an invitation to awareness, to notice whose voices you trust automatically and whose you question, to ask why you believe what you believe, to remember that the most comfortable conclusion isn't always the correct one. Let the tide of it wash over you, the injustice and the eventual reckoning, the complexity and the lesson. Breathe slowly now. Let the sound of waves replace words. Let the rhythm of the sea carry you towards sleep. The letters were written long ago. The envelopes were opened. The truth emerged, late but real. You can let it rest now. Good night.